Before I start this video, I want to acknowledge that others have covered this topic too. Norte, I hope I pronounced that right, and Radking, and probably others. Anyway, it's something that I've always been fascinated by, and it's been on my mind since Fallout 3 came out, so I wanted to give my own take on this topic. Also, as some of you might have seen in a recent channel post, things have been a bit of a struggle. Therefore, I'm going to start very briefly pointing people to my Patreon, channel memberships, and remind people to like, hype, and comment on the videos, and also probably look at relevant sponsorships going forward. The algorithm is unforgiving, and I need all the help I can get, to be honest. I never wanted to have to do this, but if you're curious to know more about my reasoning, take a look at the channel post from 31st October 2025. Anyway, now that's all out the way, let's get into the actual video. When I first stepped out of Vault 101 into Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland way back in 2008, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. The year was supposed to be 2277, 2 whole centuries after the Great War. Yet the world around me looked and felt like the apocalypse had only just happened. Ruined buildings stood exactly as the bombs left them. Nearly everything was still irradiated. From open water to old grocery food, as if decades of decay and weather had done nothing. Scavengers still scrounged pre-war junk from every other abandoned store, finding surprisingly abundant supplies even after 200 years of looting. And the people, well, the people seemed stuck in a post-nuclear Stone Age, struggling in tiny settlements with hardly any trace of the new societies and nations that the other Fallout games show rising from the ashes. Obviously, it wasn't just me noticing these oddities. As I pointed out earlier, others had made videos on them. But beyond the videos, over time I discovered I wasn't alone. A lot of Fallout fans have scratched their heads at Fallout 3's place in the timeline. How could Washington DC still be such a desolate, lawless ruin 200 years on, when by the same era places out west had thriving towns, even an organised government? The disparity was so striking that a fan theory began to circulate. What if Fallout 3 was originally meant to take place much earlier, perhaps only a few decades after the Great War? And only later in development did Bethesda push it further down the timeline? In other words, was Fallout 3 initially conceived as a prequel of sorts, a story set closer to 2077 that got reworked into a 2277 setting to tie in with Fallout's existing lore? At first reading, it sounds far-fetched, a wild community rumour, but the more I dug into it over the years, the more I found intriguing evidence lending credence to the idea. In-game inconsistencies, cut content, odd bits of lore, and even some developer commentary all start to paint a picture that maybe Fallout 3's world was designed with an earlier time frame in mind. So in this video, we'll take a closer look at the theory. We'll examine the hints within Fallout 3's world that suggest a timeline out of sync, explore community theories and rumours about the game's original concept, look at development and cut content clues from Bethesda's own team, and weigh it all up against official lore. By the end, we'll consider just how plausible this theory really is, and what it would mean for Fallout if the Capital Wasteland was indeed meant to be seen much closer to Doomsday than the far future it ended up being set in. Now, one of the strongest arguments fueling this theory is simply the state of the world in Fallout 3. The Capital Wasteland of 2277 looks, in many ways, how we'd expect it to look only 20 or 30 years after a nuclear holocaust, not 200 years after. Several pretty obvious signs suggest the game world might have been designed as if the bombs fell relatively recently. First off, we have the minimal recovery of the environment. Nearly all water sources are still heavily irradiated, rivers, lakes, even rain puddles. 2 centuries of rain and natural dilution should have cleared a lot of this radiation. Indeed, in Fallout 1 and 2, set 80 to 160 years post-war, pockets of radiation exist, but clean water and farms also exist too. In Fallout 3, however, the ambient radiation feels like the war's aftermath is still fresh, which would make far more sense in, say, 2100 than in 2277. The DC landscape also remains largely barren. There's hardly any regrowth of vegetation apart from one unique oasis of green, more on that later. It gives the impression of a place still locked in nuclear winter rather than one where nature has had 2 centuries to begin healing. For a bit of real-world confirmation, all you have to do is look at places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are effectively normal after less than a century. Then you have Chernobyl, which, while irradiated, has normal life growing everywhere. You don't need Harold creating new forests and life there, and that's only been about 40 years. Next up, we have the absolute abundance of pre-war junk and scavenging as a viable way of life. In Fallout 3, entire settlements like Megaton and Rivet City survive by collecting and repurposing pre-war scrap and food. Amazingly, intact pre-war food, sugar bombs, fancy lads, snack cakes, etc. are still edible and all over the place, and first aid boxes are still stocked with usable meds. Lore-wise, this stretches belief for 200-year-old leftovers, but it fits perfectly if only a generation or two had passed since the war. By comparison, in Fallout New Vegas, set just 4 years after Fallout 3, we're told that New California had been picked clean of salvage by then, meaning in 200 years, survivors would normally have long since looted anything of value. Yet, DC is littered with untouched caches of goods. And, you could say the same thing about Fallout 4 as well, to be honest. As Fallout Wiki contributor Tagaziel notes, the Capital Wasteland's availability of salvageable goods is suspiciously high for a region inhabited by scavengers for over 2 centuries. As a side note, we'll be hearing from Tagaziel throughout this video. Anyway, it's like the ruins were never properly picked over, which would make sense if humans only recently started crawling back out of shelters. And then we have the stalled society and empty history. Perhaps the biggest tell is what's missing. Any significant post-war history in the Capital Wasteland prior to the events of Fallout 3. In the Western Fallout games, by 2161 in Fallout 1 and 2241 Fallout 2, we see burgeoning settlements, factions, even the early NCR forming. People are rebuilding civilization, but in Fallout 3's East Coast, virtually nothing happened for 160 plus years after 2077. At least nothing recorded. There's a huge gap in the region's history. Only around the mid-2250s do we hear of notable events, the founding of big settlements like Rivet City in the 2230s, the arrival of the Brotherhood of Steel in 2255, etc. But before that, almost no local lore at all, just a long dark age of scavenging and surviving. It's as if the Capital Wasteland remained frozen in anarchy and decay until a few decades ago. This is exactly what you'd expect if the game were set around 2100, just 1 or 2 generations after the bombs, when people would still be regrouping. But by 2277 we'd anticipate some established nations, or at least regional powers. Instead, Fallout 3's world feels like society's reboot never got off the ground. The Capital Wasteland is much more immediate post-apocalypse in vibe, as Tagaziel observed, rather than the post-apocalypse setting Fallout is known for. And then, even the origin stories of Fallout 3's towns seem a bit confused about how much time has passed. Megaton, the iconic town built around an undetonated bomb, has lore implying it was founded right after the Great War. That is, if we are to believe that it's connected to the people who wanted to get access to Vault 101 but were denied. An elderly resident, Manya, talks about her grandfather helping found Megaton when she was a girl. She's about 60 in 2277, which suggests the founding happening about 50 years before that, which would take us to 2227, give or take. This would be far too late for it to be settled by people who had survived the initial blasts and wanted into Vault 101. Other accounts and the official timeline say that Megaton's crater was first settled just days after the bombs in 2077 by survivors who couldn't get into Vault 101. So they agree with the idea that that was the initial people that were there. According to that, these survivors huddled in the crater for a generation, and only later, around 2241, did they build the metal walls and formally establish the town. Sure, it isn't absolutely conclusive, and it's open to interpretation. A lot of it is a bit unclear, but it certainly sounds to me like 2 different narratives grafted together. One placing Megaton's founding, or at least some form of it, in the immediate post-war years, and another placing its fortification over 160 years later. And it raises other questions like, why would they wait that long to put walls up, or found the settlement officially? Even those questions stretch credibility on their own. These inconsistencies made me wonder if the timeline was changed to push Megaton, and by extension the whole game, further into the future. In an earlier setting, say the 2080s, Manya's story of her grandfather founding the town in her youth could literally refer to 2077. By 2277, to me, that story only makes sense if her great-grandfather founded it, which isn't what she says in-game. The simplest explanation for me is that Megaton was originally imagined as a fledgling outpost in the 2080s, not a 200-year-old settlement. At least that's how it feels to me. This part is a bit subjective, I know, but it's part of what made me suspicious about the timeline. And then we move on to one of the crazier ones, and this is one that I call Little Lamplight's impossible population. So Little Lamplight then is a settlement run entirely by children under 16. And according to Fallout 3 lore, Little Lamplight was founded immediately after the war in 2078 by a group of school kids who were trapped in a cavern during the nukes and survived. All the adults died, leaving the kids to form their own little society. It's a clever and dark piece of lore until you realise it's somehow persisted for 2 centuries. Every kid who turns 16 is exiled as a Mungo and no adults are ever allowed, yet Little Lamplight still has a thriving bunch of children in 2277. How? Where are new children coming from after 200 years? Fallout 3 never really explains this. The original kids from 2077 would have grown up by the 2090s at the latest, and without adults to, well, create more kids, the place should have emptied out within a generation or 2. Some players have headcanons like perhaps they periodically adopt orphans from the Wasteland, but it's not stated in-game, at least not explicitly when it comes to a possible explanation. According to a poster on Reddit, as nonsensical as the settlement is, the kids in Little Lamplight are indeed having their own children before they leave. Bumble is the youngest resident of Little Lamplight at 6 years old. A particularly interesting segment of her entry in the official game guide is such. She sometimes carries around a teddy bear that used to be her mother's and has been passed down through generations of Lamplighters. So in a way it is addressed somewhat, but it feels a bit like spitting sellotape over a change that would have made the settlement completely nonsensical. And also, would Bethesda really want to dig into the implications of this? I mean, do the math here. The kids are kicked out at 16 and children are still being born there? Super controversial stuff. I cannot believe that Bethesda would be hinting at that if they could avoid it, or at least they wouldn't have originally planned such super insanely dark lore. So if the timeline was changed, as I suspect, they had to paper over the cracks of these implications and just kind of not talk about it, or hint at it. Anyway, it's a serious logical hole if we take the 2277 timeline literally. But if Fallout 3 had been set, say, only 20 or 30 years after the war, Little Lamplight's existence is far more believable. The original founder kids would still be young or middle-aged, and a population of only children could conceivably be the short-term aftermath of their parents' deaths. Maintaining a kiddie commune for 200 years strains credulity to the breaking point to me. It feels like a concept Bethesda loved, an all-kids town, without fully reconciling it with the game's late timeline. Again, suggesting that the timeline might have been a later adjustment to the setting rather than its original design parameter. So, those are just a few of the standout world-building oddities that make much more sense if Fallout 3's world was initially envisioned closer to 2077. To revisit a quote from earlier on, in general the feel of the region is much more immediate post-apocalypse than the post-post-apocalypse the series is famous for. The Capital Wasteland feels stuck in year 20, not year 200. Another big clue to why the timeline might have been pushed later lies in Fallout 3's choice of factions. Bethesda famously brought back the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave, arguably the 2 most iconic factions from the earlier Fallout games. In order to include them believably, Fallout's established lore more or less dictated that the game occur after the events of Fallout 1 and 2, which took place in 2161 and 2242 respectively. If Fallout 3 had been set, say, around 2100 or 2120, neither the Brotherhood nor the Enclave would normally be present on the East Coast yet, at least not as we know them. It's suspected that Bethesda deliberately placed Fallout 3 in 2277 to justify including these popular factions, whereas an earlier setting might have required leaving them out or drastically reimagining them. Let's consider the Brotherhood of Steel first. In Fallout lore, the Brotherhood was founded in California in 2077 by US Army deserters, and for a long time they operated only on the West Coast. Fallout 3 introduces the Lion Brotherhood, a splinter group that trekked east to DC, but according to canon, that expedition didn't arrive in the Capital Wasteland until 2255. Indeed, Elder Owen Lyons led his troops from Lost Hills and established the Citadel at the Pentagon as their base in the 2250s. So, if Fallout 3 was set much earlier, the Brotherhood logically couldn't be in Washington at all unless Bethesda completely ignored previous lore. Now, obviously, this is the reason for the time. Looking at Fallout 76, which is set very soon after the war, we can see that the Brotherhood are in Appalachia, but what we're talking about here is what Bethesda was thinking at the time when Fallout 3 was in development. So that's what I'm getting at. The timeline was shifted because they thought it wouldn't be justified, and obviously their thinking has changed since then. So my theoretical reading of their thinking at the time is that by making the year 2277, Bethesda had the freedom to say, yes, the Brotherhood is here, they arrived 20 years ago. And this allowed them to use the Brotherhood as a major faction, which they clearly wanted, though notably they wrote them with a twist. Lyons' knights acting as altruistic protectors, breaking with the Brotherhood's usual hoarding doctrine. Many fans suspect that Bethesda always intended the Brotherhood to be part of Fallout 3 because they're such a recognisable faction and element of the franchise. If the initial concept had been a prequel closer to 2077, the Brotherhood's absence would have been glaring, so the theory goes that Bethesda abandoned the prequel idea in order to time jump and get the Brotherhood into the story. As one Reddit poster puts it, the game was pushed to the current date as they wanted to include the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave. And speaking of the Enclave, they're the remnants of the pre-war US government, first revealed as villains in Fallout 2, which is set in 2241 to 2242. Fallout 2 ends with the player character obliterating the Enclave's oil rig base off California, seemingly crippling them. Fallout 3, set 35 years later, shows the Enclave alive and well on the East Coast under President John Henry Eden, explaining that, after the oil rig's destruction, surviving Enclave personnel regrouped at a secret bunker, Raven Rock, near DC. This timeline works, but it's a bit convenient. It allows the Enclave to be present as antagonists, but only because Fallout 3 is placed after Fallout 2's events. If Fallout 3 had been set earlier, say the 2080s or 2100, the Enclave would certainly exist. They were hiding out after the war. But they likely wouldn't be openly active in power armor yet, and crucially their advanced technology, like the advanced power armor Mark II we see in-game, wouldn't exist that early. For instance, the Enclave's signature advanced power armor was developed around 2215 in lore. In a 2100 setting, they'd only have standard T-51B suits at best. President Eden himself, an AI program in Raven Rock, might not even have been in charge that early. Fallout 3's backstory implies Eden took control of the Enclave remnants sometime after the oil rig was destroyed. So, to feature the Enclave as the big bad with all their toys, Bethesda again basically had to set the game late in the timeline. There's an interesting rumoured tidbit here. There have been suggestions that in the initial concept for Fallout 3, when it might have been a prequel, the main factions weren't going to be the Brotherhood versus Enclave at all, but rather a kind of Enclave civil war. One version of the theory posits that Bethesda's original story would have cast the Enclave in all the major roles. A morally grey, good Enclave splinter group filling the role that Lyon's Brotherhood eventually filled, a more hardline Enclave faction analogous to the Outcasts, and an outright evil Enclave faction as the endgame villains. Essentially, it speculates Fallout 3 was at first imagined as a self-contained East Coast story unrelated to Fallout 1 or 2's events, where the Enclave had a civil conflict a few decades after the war and the player's choices might influence which vision of America's remnants prevails. This would have worked if the game were around 2100, the Enclave would still be the dominant power and no Brotherhood would be on the scene. It would also neatly justify the Capital Wasteland's dire state, since the Enclave's infighting could keep the region down in those early years after the bombs. Now, I have to emphasise, this Enclave Civil War storyline is not confirmed in any official source. It's more of a community extrapolation of how a prequel Fallout 3 might have played out. The actual released game obviously went in a different direction. We got Brotherhood versus Enclave, with the Brotherhood led by Lions, acting benevolent, and the Breakaway faction, the Outcasts, representing the traditional Brotherhood attitudes. Interestingly, as we went over earlier on, that mirrors the rumoured Enclave scenario, sympathetic faction versus ruthless faction, but with the Brotherhood transplanted into the hero role. It's almost as if Bethesda wanted to use the Enclave as both villains and potential anti-heroes, but ended up giving the heroic mantle to the Brotherhood instead, once they decided to include them. If indeed they shifted the timeline forward to 2277, it allowed them to have both factions present, arguably at the cost of some logical consistency in the world. And as we've seen so far, plenty of logical inconsistencies did crop up. There's one other small weird thing I always noticed. President Eden's famous patriotic radio speeches in Fallout 3 sound out of place for 2277. Eden raves on and on about American pride and anti-communist sentiment on Enclave radio, rallying the true Americans out there. But remember, this is 2 centuries after the United States literally ceased to exist as a nation. By then, most wasteland inhabitants are descendants with no memory of the pre-war USA, and new cultures like tribal groups or regional states have taken shape. Eden's jingoistic talk would realistically fall on deaf ears after so long. It's like someone trying to invoke the glory of the Roman Empire today, for example. However, if Fallout 3 were set much earlier, that kind of messaging makes more sense. In, say, 2100, there would still be survivors who remember America. People who directly lost their country. So appealing to lingering national identity and hatred of the Chinese Reds would be far more effective only a generation or 2 after the war. In 2277 it's borderline absurd, though Fallout does stretch absurdity at times. This again hints that many story elements in Fallout 3, from the Enclave's tech and goals to their propaganda style, feel better suited to an earlier timeline. So to sum up this section, the inclusion of the Brotherhood and Enclave is a double-edged sword for Fallout 3's world coherence. On one hand, it gives fans familiar factions and cool power armor fights, but on the other, it locks the game into the late 2200s, which may have conflicted with how the world was initially designed. So the theory suggests Bethesda may have originally planned a prequel without those factions and then changed course, or at least that in building the game world they unintentionally crafted something that felt like a 2100s setting, and then shoehorned Brotherhood Enclave on top. And as we've seen, many of the inconsistencies can be explained by such a change of tack. So what are we going to look at next? Well, we're going to see what insights we can gain from developer commentary and the game's development history. Is there any concrete evidence that Fallout 3's story or setting changed during production? It's one thing to speculate from in-game evidence, but what do we know about Fallout 3's actual development? Bethesda hasn't outright said, oh, we originally set it earlier in the timeline. However, by examining cut content, early design documents, developer talks, things like that, we can see that Fallout 3's story and world went through significant changes from concept to release. And while most of these known changes don't explicitly mention the timeline, they show a project in flux, and some of those fluxes align with the theory. At least to me. And not just to me. One valuable source is a detailed write-up by a modder and researcher named Vaughn, who compiled notes on Fallout 3's development and cut content. According to this research, Bethesda's team had a secret original map for Fallout 3 dating back to around 2005, early in development, that differs from the final game world. This prototype map, found hidden in the game files, reveals that many locations, Megaton, Little Lamplight, Raven Rock, Oasis, etc., were conceptualized from the start, but were arranged differently on the map, and the map itself was smaller. Later in development, around 2007, the designers decided to expand the world map significantly to space things out, after finding the wasteland felt too cramped. They literally added chunks of land to the north and west during alpha, moving and renaming some locations, a massive change just 6 months before release. So why is this relevant? Well, it shows that even relatively late, Bethesda was rearranging the world layout and points of interest, suggesting that earlier versions of the story were quite flexible about where things happened. Notably, Little Lamplight was originally located elsewhere on the map. Its cell name in the editor indicates it moved. Oasis, the one green spot in the wasteland, was initially positioned near Evergreen Mills, and apparently was meant to be part of the main quest at one point. In the final game, Oasis is a side quest somewhat disconnected from the main story, but early on, the presence of lush green trees in Oasis, and the unique character Harold, the talking tree ghoul, might have been tied into the central narrative. This could hint that Bethesda was toying with the theme of restoring life to the wasteland more prominently, a theme very consistent with a post-apocalyptic timeline where regrowth is possible. The fact Oasis got downplayed could indicate a shift in focus. Perhaps if the game was originally earlier, the wasteland's sterility would be taken for granted, and as they moved the timeline later, they introduced Oasis to show something had grown, but then relegated it to a side story when it didn't fit the main plot. And what I find more striking though are hints about the original main storyline from cut content. Through various sources, including the game's manual and concept art, fans were able to piece together a probable earlier version of Fallout 3's main quest. The broad strokes are similar. It's still about the lone wanderer chasing Dad and the Enclave interfering, but there are some radical differences in execution. One reconstructed plot outline, an educated guess based on developer info, goes like this. You, the player, search for Dad, hearing he went to Project Purity. The Jefferson Memorial then left holotapes saying he was seeking Dr. Stanislas Braun, the Vault-Tec scientist in Vault 112. All sounding quite familiar so far. You find Dad in Vault 112's Tranquility Lane simulation with Braun, just as in the normal release game, and after freeing him, he reveals he was trying to get the Gek for use in Project Purity. And this is where things start to get a little bit different. If we skip to the part where Dad dies in the Purity control room, well, in this version he doesn't. Instead, he survives longer. You learn of a green oasis in the northwest said to be created by a Gek, and you travel there. Oasis grew because of the forced evolutionary virus leaking or used there. Obviously this would be a really interesting twist because FEV is what creates super mutants, but in this version of the story it's implicated in creating fertile greenery. Dad's interest in Oasis implies that Project Purity's plan might have considered using FEV or Gek biotech to heal the land. Now, presumably at this point in the alternate quest, your dad would have gone off to try and get a hold of this information from Vault 87, so you go there following him. Vault 87 is of course the source of the super mutants and FEV in the Capital Wasteland. So in this version of events, you actually find your father inside Vault 87, and horrifyingly, he's in the process of being dipped in FEV and turning into a super mutant. He begs you to end his life, and you're forced to mercy kill your own father. This is a much darker and more emotionally charged twist than the final game's version of James heroically sacrificing himself at Project Purity. After that, you retrieve the Gek from Vault 87, and as in the final game, the Enclave ambushes and captures you at that point. You then awaken in Raven Rock, and things play out pretty much as in the release version from here on out. The ending would still involve the giant robot Liberty Prime and the assault on Project Purity, but as a final side note, there was a cut quest where you infiltrate Enclave-occupied Rivet City to steal a power source for Liberty Prime first. All these story changes show that Fallout 3's plot was being heavily iterated, which of course is completely normal for a game in development. But how does this relate to the timeline theory? The connections are subtle but there. For instance, the idea of Oasis and a miracle green zone being central suggests a potential theme of jump-starting the wasteland's recovery. And that theme resonates with the notion of Fallout 3 perhaps originally aiming to show the very first signs of the world healing, which would be a great angle if the game was a prequel closer to the war. In a 2277 setting, widespread regrowth should probably have happened already in many areas, as seen in Fallout 2 in New Vegas. So making such a big deal of Oasis is a bit odd, but if it were only a few decades after the war, a single verdant oasis would indeed be a shocking, almost mystical discovery, the first bloom of life returning. So in this telling of the story, a Harold-free oasis, which was caused by FEV, would be absolutely a reason that the player could bring new life to the wasteland, which would act as a counterbalance to the Enclave's plan to sterilise it. And if we link back to the earlier theory that there were meant to be multiple Enclave factions in a civil war, it could be the evil Enclave that wanted to sterilise the wasteland and the morally grey ones that wanted to use the potential of Oasis to bring life back to the wasteland. So while this pieced together potential alternate story is interesting, what we don't see in any dev commentary is a direct statement like, we initially set the story in year X and then changed it. However, we do have a few developer remarks that touch on the timeline indirectly. For example, Fallout 3's lead writer Emil Pagliarulo once explained the rationale behind the character Alistair Tenpenny, the wealthy ghoul-hating British tycoon who built Tenpenny Tower. A lot of players, me included, wondered how on earth is there an actual British guy in 2277 America? Wouldn't he be like a descendant with an American accent by now? Emil clarified that indeed Tenpenny immigrated from Britain himself, meaning he personally made the journey overseas post-war. Emil said that this was intended to hint that Europe and the UK were in even worse shape, implying Tenpenny fled across the ocean to find fortune in America. It's a neat idea for world building, but it raises more questions than it answers. We're talking about a world with no functioning international travel infrastructure, so how did Tenpenny sail across the Atlantic? The fact that Bethesda wrote what is to me such a far-fetched backstory suggests they might not have initially considered the timeline or logistics fully, they just really wanted a classic British aristocrat archetype in the game. From the prequel theory perspective, Tenpenny's concept makes loads more sense if Fallout 3 were set closer to 2077, because in that scenario you could have had actual surviving British expatriates who came over shortly after the war when some ships or planes might still function. Tenpenny's accent and age would stand out a lot less in 2120 than in 2277. Yet, if the theory about the game being set earlier is true, Bethesda kept him in 2277 using a bit of hand-wavy lore to justify it. There are several other examples in Fallout 3 that feel similarly anachronistic. Colin Moriarty, for instance, runs his saloon in Megaton with a thick Irish accent and the mannerisms of a 20th century barkeep, complete with talk of the old country. In a society that's supposedly been isolated for centuries, the persistence of a distinct Irish accent feels implausible unless he were born not long after the bombs fell. Likewise, the community of Andale, who present themselves as a wholesome slice of old suburban America while secretly being cannibals, behave as if the cultural memory of pre-war America is still fresh, not a 2-century-old myth. Then there's Vault 108, where the endless Gary clones continue to roam and attack as if the experiment had gone wrong only a few years ago, where to me, after 2 centuries, the Vault's supplies and power should be long depleted and the clones themselves long dead. And of course, we can't forget Sierra Petrovita and Girder Shade, who treats Nuka-Cola as if it's still a living brand, quoting slogans, obsessing over bottle designs, and speaking as if she was someone who grew up drinking it, not a distant descendant romanticising the past. And I'm sure there are more details and examples that I've missed that also back up the theory. To me personally, it's little Lamplight that we touched upon earlier that seals the deal on all of this. But as you've seen, there are many examples of things that don't quite fit in the timeline as presented by the game. Of course, devil's advocate, this sort of design choice, prioritising cool characters and iconic factions over strict plausibility, is something Bethesda's known for. One commentator on the Fallout lore forum suspected that the inconsistencies were not evidence of a moved timeline at all, but simply the result of Bethesda's style. I personally don't buy the theory, they said. I suspect the plot holes are results of Bethesda wanting cool things then finding ways to justify them, rather than them purposely designing an ultra-realistic world set right after the war and then moving it forward. In other words, maybe Fallout 3 was always going to be in 2277 and the devs just weren't overly concerned with making every detail logical for 200 years of decay. They were more concerned with creating a certain atmosphere and including beloved elements like the Brotherhood. This is a fair counter-argument. Bethesda's spin on Fallout does often go for rule of cool and thematic tone, even if it clashes with prior lore. We've seen that in Fallout 4 and 76 too. So we do have to allow for the possibility that all these clues we've discussed are simply the byproduct of Bethesda's approach to the franchise, not evidence of an alternate plan. However, considering everything we've compiled, the environmental clues, the lore gaps, the faction timing, the cut content hints, the idea that Fallout 3 could have been intended as a sort of standalone prequel is not so easily dismissed, but it's impossible to confirm too. Going back to Takaziel, one of the Fallout community veterans and wiki admins we heard from earlier, they said, after listing the inconsistencies, "There is no smoking gun, however, so make of that what you wish." And really, that's the size of it. There's no smoking gun, just smoke. So, after sifting through the clues relating to Fallout 3's potentially changed timeline, where do we stand? Did we find proof that the game was definitely meant to take place earlier? Not quite. As Takaziel said, there's no actual smoking gun. Bethesda never came out and said, "Hey, we pushed the date forward." So we're left with a lot of circumstantial evidence and educated guesswork, but taken together, all those little clues form a pretty compelling picture. It's a bit like looking at an unfinished puzzle. The pieces we have suggest an image of Fallout 3 as a game world stuck in the 2080s or 2100s, an irradiated DC that never advanced beyond the immediate aftermath of nuclear war. The decision to set it in 2277 with all the baggage of Fallout lore sometimes feels almost like an afterthought, or at least a choice that Bethesda made for the benefits of continuity and familiarity rather than the coherence of the setting. Personally speaking, I find it quite plausible that during early development Bethesda played with the idea of a Fallout game set much closer to the Great War. It would have freed them up to tell a fresh story without worrying too much about Fallout 1 and 2's events. Imagine Fallout 3 as a true prequel, no established Brotherhood of Steel in DC, no Enclave as we know them. Instead, maybe the ancestors of the Enclave, or entirely new factions rising from the Pentagon or the Capitol. The Capital Wasteland's devastation would make perfect sense, and we might witness the first attempts at rebuilding civilization. It could have been a very different narrative, perhaps more tragic or more exploratory of how society crawls out of the rubble. However, Bethesda clearly also wanted to honour the legacy of Fallout. Todd Howard and Emil Pagliarulo have mentioned in interviews how conscious they were of meeting fan expectations, including the iconic Ron Perlman intro monologue, the Brotherhood Knights, the Vault Boy aesthetic, etc, etc. Setting Fallout 3 as a sequel after Fallout 2 allowed them to include direct references like the mention of the Chosen One destroying the Enclave oil rig, or the presence of Harold, a character from Fallout 1 and 2. Those touches gave longtime fans a thread of continuity. In a pure prequel set in 2100, none of those specific callbacks could exist. To me, it's almost as if Bethesda tried to have their cake and eat it. They constructed a world that feels like a raw post-war wasteland, the cake, but then plopped in familiar factions and late lore references on top, the icing, even if they didn't 100% fit the base. The end result, the Fallout 3 as we know it, is a bit anachronistic internally, a 23rd century setting wearing 22nd century clothes. Most players either didn't notice or don't mind because the game's atmosphere and gameplay are strong. And don't mistake my theorising for criticism, I really do love the game, and I adore it. But for lore enthusiasts or those who think too much, it's noticeable, hence this whole theory taking root. Ultimately, the Fallout 3 prequel theory remains just that, a theory, yet it's one that makes us reconsider the game's story in a new light. I can't help but imagine an alternate Fallout 3 where we walk those broken streets in the 2100s, rubbing shoulders with the first generation of survivors. I can't help but wonder what that would have been like. So if you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you, I really appreciate that. And that's pretty much us, it's a wrap. That's us. So, did you ever wonder about this? Do you agree or disagree with the theory? Let me know in the comments down below. And as a final note, this is something I never used to do, as you know, but if you've made it this far, please drop a like or a hype or whatever into the stats on this video. It will really help. Thank you.